Don't touch me. You're just the waitress. Know your place. The words cracked through the midday air like a whip, sharp enough to make nearby tables fall silent for a breath. Clara Monroe stood frozen for a fraction of a second, a polished silver tray balanced steadily in her hand, chilled beads of water sliding down the sides of crystal glasses. Victor Hale's voice had not been loud, but it carried an authority sharpened by decades of boardroom battles. His pale gray eyes flickered with disdain as he dabbed at the sleeve of his suit jacket, where a drop of condensation from her tray had landed. Clara's hand instinctively moved forward with a folded napkin, her voice quiet, but even as she offered, "Let me wipe it for you, sir." Victor recoiled slightly in his chair, his jaw stiffening. "Don't. I said know your place." He turned his head toward the sweeping view of Central Park as if she had ceased to exist. A faint, uneasy chuckle rippled among a few nearby executives, the kind of laughter meant more to cover discomfort than to encourage it. The umbrellas overhead rustled softly in the breeze, and the clinking of silver cutlery resumed, though slower, as though every movement had become self-conscious. Clara lowered her hand without a word, placing the napkin gently back on the edge of the table before turning away. Her steps were measured, her spine straight, the tray balanced without tremor. From a distance, no one could tell her pulse raced, or that the back of her throat tightened against words she refused to say. She did not see the black SUVs glide up to the restaurant's valet stand, but everyone else did. Heads turned toward the entrance as uniformed attendants in crisp vests opened doors with polished precision. Out stepped Charles Hawthorne, silver hair gleaming under the Manhattan sun, his navy suit cut with the kind of perfection that spoke not just of money but of taste and how to spend it. Two assistants trailed behind him, carrying sleek leather folders and murmuring into earpieces as though every step of his arrival deserved orchestration. Charles inhaled the air theatrically, squinting at the tables beneath the large white umbrellas as though the entire restaurant was his personal stage. Without waiting to greet a single guest, he snapped his fingers at a waiter hovering nearby. "Espresso. Double shot. Hot. And make it quick. The world runs on time, not pleasantries." Guests shifted in their seats. Some smiled politely at the arrogance. Others rolled their eyes discreetly. But no one openly challenged him. Charles had that kind of presence. The sort of man who believed his success gave him license to fill every room with noise. At the head table, already settled with a quiet authority of his own, Victor Hale glanced up from the papers he had been reviewing. His calmness contrasted sharply with Charles's flamboyance. He set down his reading glasses, his expression revealing little beyond a flicker of disapproval before he returned to his notes. Clara moved carefully between tables, the sun catching faint highlights in her tied-back hair as she balanced another tray, this one holding bottles of sparkling and still water nested in ice. Her crisp uniform gave her the same anonymity as the other servers, but there was something about the way she carried herself, shoulders squared, chin poised, that didn't quite fit. When she approached a guest and asked softly, "Still or sparkling, sir?" the refinement in her tone was almost out of place among waitstaff. A few guests exchanged subtle looks, as if they sensed something unfamiliar in her presence but couldn't name it. Charles noticed her too, though not with curiosity, only opportunity. As she leaned slightly to pour from a chilled bottle, he let out a laugh pitched just loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Funny how some people think serving drinks is a career," he said, lounging back in his chair with his arm draped across the rest. "Don't worry, sweetheart. One day you'll see a real boardroom." The words drew reluctant chuckles. Some glanced at Clara, waiting for her to blush or fumble. Instead, she finished pouring without spilling a drop, her face composed, her eyes steady on the glass. Charles wasn't satisfied. He watched as she subtly steadied the corner of his folder, which had been close to sliding from the polished teak surface. He smirked. "Careful, darling. You're not trained for billion-dollar papers. Just stick to glasses." For the first time, Clara responded. Her voice was even, measured, but carried just enough resonance to quiet the murmurs around them. "Sometimes glasses hold more than you think, sir." The hush that followed was brief, but noticeable. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending to be occupied with their cutlery. Charles's smile faltered only a moment before he covered it with another laugh. "Cute. Very cute." Clara moved on, unhurried. She didn't glance back. Later, as the waitstaff refreshed tables, Victor tested her again. He deliberately dropped his linen napkin onto the ground near where she stood, bending just slightly as though to remind her of the task. Clara knelt smoothly, retrieving it without hesitation. As she rose, he murmured, low but cutting, "That's your place. On the ground. Don't confuse it with the head of the table." The air seemed to tighten. Even nearby staff froze, their eyes flicking toward Clara in muted sympathy. She folded the napkin neatly, placed it back onto the table, and with the faintest of smiles, said, "Every place matters, sir. Even the ground has to be kept clean." Victor's gaze lingered on her, sharper now, as though testing the edges of her composure. She met it only briefly before moving on. The hum of conversation resumed, lighter but forced. Guests filled the lull with talk of stock prices and innovation, but the earlier exchanges hovered like static no one could clear. Charles leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of white wine before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, his eyes darting toward Clara as she refilled cups at a neighboring table. "The trouble with America today," he said, "is people content to serve coffee instead of building companies. No offense, but some people just don't belong in real business." A round of laughter followed, some polite, some genuine. Charles clapped his hand against the table, reveling in his own wit. Clara's hand remained steady as she poured, her gaze on the cup. "Sometimes those who serve," she said softly, "notice things others miss." The conversation around the table faltered. Victor's pen hovered over his notes. For the first time, he glanced at her not as a servant, but as though considering what else might lie behind the calm words. She didn't look at him, didn't look at Charles, only finished the pour and stepped back. Charles cleared his throat and forced another laugh, trying to smooth the silence. "See? Even the help thinks she's a philosopher." He turned to another server passing by, this time a young man barely out of his teens who carried a heavy tray of dishes. "Careful there, champ. Don't trip over your shoelaces, or you'll cost us all a fortune." The boy flushed red, lowering his head as a few guests chuckled awkwardly. Charles smirked in satisfaction, sipping his wine as though humiliation was his preferred appetizer. Clara, nearby, pressed her lips together but said nothing. She steadied the tray for the boy just long enough for him to set it down safely, her expression unreadable. Victor noticed. So did two of the younger executives, though neither spoke up. The sun filtered gently through the canopy of white umbrellas, casting soft patterns of light across the polished tables. A breeze carried laughter from a distant table where no one had noticed the tension. Yet at the head table, silence stretched thin again. Victor leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but firm, cutting into the billionaire's monologue. "Leave the young woman a chair," he said, without looking. Directly at Charles. His tone was measured, the kind of voice that didn't demand but made refusal nearly impossible. The table shifted. Some of the executives exchanged confused glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. Charles let out a laugh, sharp and dismissive. "What for? She's here to carry trays, not contracts." Victor's pen rested lightly between his fingers. He didn't look at Charles, only motioned with the faintest tilt of his head toward the empty seat near the edge of the table. Even the person carrying trays sees the table differently than those sitting at it. The silence that followed was heavier than before. A few assistants standing in the background shuffled awkwardly, uncertain if they should intervene. Clara, still holding her tray, blinked as if she wasn't sure she'd heard him either. "I appreciate the thought, sir," she said carefully, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the polished teak. "But I have work to do." Victor finally looked at her. His eyes, gray and calm, lingered for a moment longer than polite. "Work can wait. Insight doesn't." Charles scoffed, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated exasperation. "This is absurd. Next thing you know, we'll be asking the busboy to weigh in on market forecasts." He sipped his wine, smug, certain the table would laugh with him. But no one did. The executives shifted uncomfortably, and the young server Charles had mocked earlier kept his head low, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The breeze stirred the umbrellas overhead, and the murmur of conversation from nearby tables seemed suddenly distant, like the whole city had paused just outside their circle. Victor set his pen down on the table, deliberately, and gestured to the empty seat again. "Miss Monroe, please." Clara hesitated, her pulse quickening. She had not expected to be drawn in this way, not yet. The plan had always been to observe, to watch how Charles conducted himself when no one thought power was watching. And yet here was Victor Hale, calling her forward, forcing her hand. She set her tray carefully on a nearby side stand, untied the half apron at her waist, and draped it neatly over the tray's edge. Without a word, she pulled the chair back and sat down, her posture composed, her face unreadable. Charles stared at her as though the sight was offensive. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But Victor ignored him, flipping open the folder in front of him. The weight of cameras hovering at the edges of the terrace grew heavier, though none dared come too close before the official signing. Guests at nearby tables whispered, stealing glances at the head table where the unlikely scene unfolded. Charles broke the silence with a sneer. "Fine. If we're going to waste time, let's make it entertaining. Tell me, sweetheart, what do you know about billion-dollar mergers? How many glasses of water does that take to serve?" Clara's hands folded lightly in her lap. She looked at him, unflinching. "Enough to know when the glass is about to spill over," she said softly. Charles barked a laugh. Cryptic, charming, and utterly useless. But Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, his interest sharpening. "Go on," he said, his voice even. Clara hesitated, then leaned forward just slightly, her tone calm, but edged with quiet precision. "I watch. That's my job, isn't it? To see what others don't. I've watched you today, Mr. Hawthorne. You talk more about yourself than the companies you're merging. You rush your assistants, bark orders, mock your staff. You enjoy control, but you don't notice the details that slip away when people are too afraid to speak around you." A faint murmur rippled at the table. One of the younger executives pressed his lips together, trying to mask a smile. Charles stiffened, his wineglass halting halfway to his lips. "And you, Mr. Hale," Clara continued, turning her gaze to Victor with the same steady calm. "You've said very little. But you test. You drop napkins. You measure silence. You wait for reactions instead of forcing them. You're not looking for a contract today. You're looking for character." For the first time, Victor allowed the faintest curve of a smile to touch his mouth. "Interesting," he murmured. Charles slammed his glass down, wine sloshing against the rim. "This is absurd. She's a waitress playing philosopher. Victor, we don't have time for riddles. Let's sign this deal and move on." But Victor didn't reach for his pen. He leaned back, studying Clara as though she had passed some unseen threshold. "Not riddles," he said. "Observations. The kind most of us forget how to make." The table sat in taut silence. The sound of clinking silverware from other guests seemed a world away, the hum of Central Park a distant whisper. Clara sat still, her breathing even, though her heart thundered against her ribs. Then the assistants arrived, carrying fresh leather folders, pens gleaming beside them. The long oak table under the largest umbrella was cleared and reset. Journalists and photographers edged closer, their cameras ready. The signing moment had come. Charles straightened in his chair, his arrogance returning like a mask snapped back into place. "Finally," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. He adjusted his cufflinks with theatrical precision. "This deal marks the future of American innovation. $4.5 billion, signed, sealed, and done." He pulled the folder close, clicked the pen, and scrawled his name with a flourish across the thick paper. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, shutters snapping like applause. He looked up, chin high, already imagining the headlines. All eyes turned to Victor Hale. He picked up his pen, turning it between his fingers, but instead of signing, he paused. His gaze swept the table, then drifted toward Clara. The air thickened. Executives exchanged startled glances. Charles frowned. "Victor, what's the holdup? Sign it. Let's make history." Victor's voice carried steady and clear. "Clara, would you join us, please?" Every head turned. The cameras clicked again, confused now, journalists whispering. Clara, still seated at the side, felt every gaze land on her like a spotlight. Slowly, she stood. She walked forward, each step unhurried, her shoes silent against the polished terrace floor. When she reached the oak table, she set her hand lightly against the wood, steady as stone. Then, in a single motion, she removed the apron still draped across her arm and set it aside. The murmurs grew louder. Reporters surged forward, lenses snapping furiously. Guests leaned closer, whispering furiously to one another. Victor gestured toward her with quiet finality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is Clara Monroe, the largest shareholder in the company you're trying to merge with." Gasps broke like a wave around the table. The sound was immediate, disbelieving. Cameras flared in bursts. Executives muttered, faces paling. Charles let out a loud, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "You're joking. This is a stunt." He looked around the table, searching for someone to confirm it. "Come on. She's a waitress. I've been watching her carry water all afternoon." Victor slid a folder forward, his movements deliberate. The papers inside bore Clara's name, her signature, her majority stock holdings in black and white. Not just a waitress. Not today. Charles's laughter faltered. He scanned the pages, the color draining from his face. This can't be." Clara spoke, her voice steady, carrying easily over the stunned murmurs. "I came here not as a shareholder, but as a waitress, to see how you treated people you thought were beneath you." She paused, her eyes locked on Charles. "You failed." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the breeze seemed to hush. The murmurs rippled across the terrace like water disturbed by a sudden gust of wind. Cameras flashed in relentless bursts, the clicks blending into a staccato rhythm that underscored Charles Hawthorne's disbelief. He leaned back in his chair, eyes wide, trying to laugh it off, but the sound came hollow, forced. "Clara, his voice faltered. Words that had once carried authority now stumbled in the open air, exposed to everyone around him. He looked toward Victor Hale, desperate for intervention, but the older man only leaned back, calm, folding his hands on the table as if nothing could startle him. Victor's gray eyes, steady and unwavering, cut through the tension like a knife. "Respect is the first line in any contract, Mr. Hawthorne," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "You tore yours up hours ago." Charles's face flushed, first red, then a pale gray, his jaw tightening as he stared down at the untouched espresso before him. He had been certain that money and power could shield him, that his wealth would intimidate and impress. But now, in front of cameras, reporters, and the very executives whose contracts he had hoped to command, he was powerless. Clara, still standing, felt the weight of every gaze on her. She didn't shrink. She didn't look down. Instead, she let the silence linger just long enough for the reality to settle in the room. The woman they had mocked, dismissed, and ignored was the one holding the power they all sought. Victor tapped the folder gently. "This is the deal as it stands. With respect, with awareness, with integrity." His eyes flicked to Clara. "And this is the person who ensures it will stay that way." Clara nodded slightly, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Then, in one composed movement, she extended her hand to shake Victor's. Their handshake was firm, deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of mutual understanding. Cameras captured the gesture, a striking contrast to the chaos around Charles. Charles finally found words, though they stumbled out like broken glass. I must apologize. This is all a misunderstanding." Victor cut him off without raising his voice, the calm authority in it even more intimidating than Charles's former bluster. "Apologies won't amend a lack of respect, Mr. Hawthorne. Contracts are written on paper, but trust is written in behavior. You lost both long before the ink dried." The press leaned forward, recording every movement, every flicker of expression. Some guests whispered, shaking their heads, while a few smirked subtly, relishing the unmasking of arrogance they had only dared imagine in private. Charles's hands gripped the table, his polished cufflinks gleaming under the soft midday light. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again, trying to recover even a shred of composure. This can't be happening." He faltered completely, swallowing his pride. The $4.5 billion merger deal, the culmination of years of strategy, planning, and power, slipped through his fingers in the span of minutes. Clara's voice broke the tension again, measured and calm. "I came here to observe, not to humiliate. But respect is earned, and it is not granted automatically because of your title or wealth." A few of the executives at the table, those who had exchanged uneasy glances throughout the meal, nodded subtly. They recognized something they had long forgotten. Character mattered more than reputation, integrity more than bravado. Victor finally signed the folder closed and pushed it gently toward Clara. "Your discretion has been remarkable," he said softly. It would have been easy to expose everything earlier, but you let people reveal themselves first. Clara smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. Sometimes the test isn't for me, she said, her gaze sweeping the table. It's for them. To see who they really are when they think no one important is watching. Charles slumped further in his chair, the color drained from his face. He picked up his pen, stared at it, then set it down again. He could feel the weight of every camera, every whisper, and every judgmental glance in the room. The deal he had thought unshakable, untouchable, was dead, right there under the sunlight of Central Park. Journalists surged forward, shouting questions, voices overlapping as they tried to capture statements. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing Clara's composed stance, Victor's quiet authority, and Charles's unraveling facade. Some guests murmured in disbelief. Others exchanged knowing looks, and a few younger staff members, those who had seen Clara serve all afternoon with dignity and poise, allowed themselves small, incredulous smiles. Charles finally spoke, his voice low, strained, almost pleading. How is this possible? She's. Victor's calm voice cut through the din, clear and commanding. She is exactly who she presented herself to be, Mr. Hawthorne. And you failed to see her for what she was capable of, the way you failed to see your own shortcomings. The remaining silence settled over the table like a velvet curtain. Charles's espresso sat untouched, cooling in the midday sun. Around him, the murmurs of admiration for Clara grew louder. People who had once dismissed her as merely a waitress now watched with a mixture of awe and respect. Clara exhaled quietly, a small, steadying breath. She turned her attention to the young assistant who had been fumbling with the folder just moments ago. You did well, she said softly. Steady hands. Watch carefully. Learn. That's how power isn't just taken, it's understood. The assistant nodded, eyes wide. The lesson had been witnessed, though not with condescension, but with dignity and instruction. Clara didn't look back at Charles as she gathered her apron from the side stand. She placed it neatly over her arm and straightened, a figure of quiet authority. No longer the waitress. She carried herself like someone who belonged at every table she ever entered. Victor spoke once more, almost to himself, almost to her. You didn't need to prove yourself. You simply observed, and we all learned. Clara allowed herself a faint nod. Cameras captured her final glance across the table at Charles, who remained seated, staring at the folder that had become a mirror of his own arrogance. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed it away, unable to reconcile the reality that his wealth could not protect him from human judgment. Guests and staff alike began to murmur in quiet admiration. Some clapped softly, others whispered among themselves, recounting the audacity and brilliance of her restraint. The lesson was clear. Humility and poise under pressure outweighed wealth, intimidation, and mockery. Victor stood, gesturing subtly toward the terrace exit. The meeting is over, he said, voice calm. Respect has been restored where it matters. Let the rest speak for itself. Clara nodded again, allowing herself one final glance at the table. Cameras captured the moment in slow bursts. Her composed face, her measured movements, the faint, almost imperceptible smile that came from knowing she had observed, endured, and emerged victorious. Charles remained slumped in his chair, alone with his untouched espresso, surrounded by people who had once deferred to his ego but now looked at him differently. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet revolution that had unfolded under the umbrellas of that Manhattan terrace. Clara stepped away, walking toward the exit with measured poise. Her apron tucked under one arm, her head held high. She carried not just trays or papers, but the authority she had always possessed, finally recognized by those who had once dismissed her. Victor followed at a respectful distance, his presence a quiet acknowledgement that she had passed every test placed before her. The photographers snapped, the journalists whispered, but none could take away the undeniable truth. Clara Monroe had transformed from the overlooked waitress to the central figure in a $4.5 billion merger's most dramatic moment. And in that transformation, in the subtle but undeniable power of observation, composure, and quiet intelligence, every person present, including Charles Hawthorne, realized that authority was not inherited, bought, or assumed. It was earned, and it could be revealed in the most unexpected ways. The cameras clicked one final time. Clara glanced over her shoulder at Victor. "Thank you," she murmured. Victor nodded. "I didn't need to test you. You tested us all." Charles remained at the head table, isolated, the sunlight reflecting off the abandoned espresso in front of him. Outside, the world continued, but inside that terrace, a lesson had been permanently etched. Clara walked away with quiet authority, a smile touching her lips. Not triumphant, not vengeful, but steady, knowing, and fully aware of the power that had always been hers. The guests whispered. The cameras clicked. And for the first time that afternoon, the tables of Manhattan seemed to understand that sometimes the most overlooked person in the room is the one who holds the most power.